Today we're going to discuss different types of poetry. Before we begin though, I want to cover some terminology. There's some words I use that you may not be familiar with. First of all, rhyme. When we talk about rhyme, in general, it just means similar sounds at the ends of words that are close together. When we talk about a rhyme scheme in a poem, however, it's basically a set pattern of rhymed words at the end of lines. Meter is kind of like the rhythm of the poem. It's the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables in poetry. And it usually has a pattern. When we talk about meter, it's a pattern. So da 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 da. A stanza is kind of like a paragraph in prose. It marks separate ideas in poetry, and it's indicated with a blank line. Literary devices are any technique that writers use to make their writing more interesting. Figurative language is an example of this. It's words and phrases that don't have their everyday meaning, words that you exaggerate or don't mean literally. When we talk about types of poetry, we're also referring to the styles or genres of poetry. But there are also two categories that I'd like to mention. The first is lyric poetry, which involves a bunch of different types of poetry. Lyric poetry focuses on emotions and thoughts, and it's usually very intense and emotional. A couple types of poems that are lyric poems are the ode and the sonnet. The second category is narrative poetry, which tells a story. It's often longer than lyric poetry. Epic poems and ballads are examples of this type. Today, we're going to identify 5 different types of poetry. The first you've probably heard of, it's haiku. Haikus are originally from Japan, and they're a short poem that connects nature to human nature. They involve strong imagery, and most of the time are written in 3 lines with 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and then 5 syllables. Free verse is poetry on almost any topic and has no set meter or rhyme scheme. It's probably the easiest type of poetry to write because it's so, free. Next we have the parody, and I wanted to talk about this because they're pretty popular right now. Parody, and it's not just in terms of poetry or songs, although we're talking about it that way in particular, imitates the style of usually a well-known song or poem to make people laugh. You may have heard of blackout poetry before. You take a previously written text, like the page of a novel, and you select the words that stand out to you, the ones that you think you can turn into a poem. Blackout poetry requires you to find words in the right order to make up a poem, and then black out all of the other words. Found poetry is similar to blackout poetry in that you're using a previously written text, but instead of having to keep the words in order and black out all the other ones, you just select whichever ones stand out for you and rework them into a poem in any order. So why does this matter? Why do I want you to know these different styles of poetry? Well, for one, knowing the different styles of poetry can allow you to explore a variety of different styles to see which one fits you best. You can push yourself as a writer and a poet by looking at a single topic and then trying to write it in different types or styles of poetry. Finally, you can find examples of the types of poetry that most interest you and learn how to create them by reading them. As I've said before, I absolutely love poetry. It allows us to connect with each other emotionally because poetry is sharing the emotions that you feel for whatever your topic is. Poetry is way more intense than prose, and it often deals with subjects and topics that we find challenging or are difficult to think about. It comes from the deepest places within us, and that's why I love to write it.